By now, everyone thinks that they know what caused the economic crash in 2008. Or at least everyone has an opinion on it. The government's Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission released a report last month that said that this crash was avoidable. They blamed everything from poor government regulation to excessive risk-taking and borrowing by households and Wall Street. But what about outside forces, terrorists or hostile nations who covertly waged economic warfare against the U.S. by using vulnerabilities in our financial system? That's what a Pentagon Commission report by financial analyst Kevin D. Friedman concluded, which the Washington Times managed to get their hands on. Now, Friedman claims that a three-phased attack was planned and is, in fact, still in the process against the U.S. economy. The first phase, speculators bid up the price of oil, filling the coffers of Sharia-compliant sovereign wealth funds. The second phase, bear raids, took down our financial institutions. And the third and yet-to-come phase, the dumping of Treasury bonds. Now, considering that nobody else has mentioned this in reports or in hearings in Congress, I think there's two ways that this could go. Either the theory is bogus, or as Friedman himself says in the report, it's just something that nobody wants to talk about. Earlier from our studio in New York, I caught up with Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital. So I first asked him if he buys the theory.
No, I don't buy it. I don't think the terrorists are smart enough to pull it off. But, you know, there were terrorists involved, but they were at the Federal Reserve. They were in Congress. They were the ones that were passing the laws and providing all the cheap money and the moral hazards. This was a homegrown act of financial terrorism perpetrated by Ben Bernanke and, of course, Alan Greenspan before him, and, you know, all of our congressmen and representatives who stacked the deck and made the financial collapse inevitable. You know, in fact, if anything, foreigners temporarily helped us out. It was all the buying of dollars and treasuries by foreign central banks that basically, stopped the collapse from being even worse. Of course, ultimately, they're going to reverse course, and we're going to have to pay for that. But they bought us a lot of time by coming to our aid.
But is it crazy to think that perhaps at some point in the future there might be financial warfare, or that perhaps, other countries that own so many of our treasury bonds might start selling them off, as, Friedman says here in the third phase?
But I don't think it's going to be an act of war. It's going to be an act of self-preservation. It's costing the world a fortune to buy up our treasuries. You know, this whole idea of a currency war, well, the object of a currency war is to inflict the most damage on your own citizens. You know, you don't want to win a currency war because you lose, because the consequence is inflation. And I think that the world is going to ultimately stop buying our bonds and sell their dollars, not because they want to hurt us, but because they're tired of hurting themselves. But when they do that, what they do is they pull the rug out from under our phony economy. That's when the dollar really collapses. Commodity prices, consumer prices go through the roof for Americans, and we're going to be confronted with a real economic crisis that will make 2008 look like a Sunday school picnic.
Oh, I can't wait for that one to happen. Now, there has been some critique, too, as to why it is that the Pentagon was commissioning any type of study to be done on the financial crisis of 2008. Do you think that there were some ulterior motives here? I mean, some people have called this anti-Muslim, the fact that they talk about, terrorists in such a way.
Well, it's just another waste of money. You know, we already had one investigation into the cause of the financial crisis, which is a complete charade. They wasted millions of dollars. They didn't do any legitimate research. They didn't have any people like myself who actually predicted the crisis in advance. They stacked the witnesses and the evidence. It was all to try to justify a preconceived conclusion that we had a financial crisis because we didn't have enough government regulation, and it was all a pretense so they can grow the government even larger. They weren't concerned about the true cause of the crisis, because if they were, they didn't even need a commission. They could have talked to me. I would have told them they could have bought one of my books for $20 on Amazon. They would have known why they had a financial crisis.
That sounds like that would have been money better spent there. I'm just curious. Yesterday, we heard from a series of interviews about Bernie Madoff calling from jail, where he essentially liked to spread a little blame, said he couldn't believe, like I can't believe, that no one has been prosecuted yet for what happened. But he also said that the whole government is a Ponzi scheme. What do you think about that?
He ought to know. You know, he is the foremost authority. He perpetuated the greatest Ponzi scheme in the history of the world. So I think that qualifies him as probably the foremost authority on Ponzi schemes. And so while he has very little credibility in other areas, this is the one area where he does have credibility. And when the person who ran the biggest Ponzi scheme in world history says the U.S. government is doing exactly what he did, I think we ought to pay attention to that man.
I think that maybe makes a lot of people out there nervous, too. Now, Ben Bernanke was testifying on Capitol Hill today. He was discussing rising oil prices and said, of course, if, the rise in prices is sustained, it could hurt the U.S. economic recovery. He also talked about rising food prices, rising commodity prices. But as usual, he kept towing the line that his quantitative easing 2 program had absolutely nothing to do with it. What do you say?
Yeah. Well, I say that Bernie Madoff has far more credibility in my mind than Ben Bernanke. Quantitative easing has everything to do with it. The reason that commodity prices are rising is because the Federal Reserve and other central banks are printing money, and so it's all the new money that's bidding up commodity prices. In fact, if you look at energy prices and you measure them in terms of things like gold and silver, real money, they're actually falling. It's only in fiat currencies where you're seeing oil prices rise, and of course oil prices are even rising more slowly than other commodity prices. It all results from monetary policy. But what I think is going to happen is I do think that other central banks are starting to acknowledge that inflation is a problem, and they're trying to deal with the consequences of rising prices. So I think foreign central banks will ultimately start to raise rates. Some of them have already done that, but they're going to raise rates more, and they're going to pull back on their purchases of U.S. currency, which means that we're not going to be able to export our inflation so easily to other countries. It's going to stay here in the United States, and we're going to have to deal with far more consequences of the inflation that Ben Bernanke is creating, not only in food and energy prices, but in all prices. And for some reason, Ben Bernanke doesn't think inflation is a problem unless it's reflected in the CPI. But remember, that whole CPI, especially the core, was reverse engineered to hide inflation. Back in the 1990s under Alan Greenspan, they redesigned the CPI. The goal was to make the number lower. They said the CPI was overstating inflation, so they fixed it. And so now the way they fixed it, it's never going to show any inflation because it's designed not to.
All right, Peter, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. And, Ben Bernanke seems perhaps a little too confident in this case. Thanks.